Hello and welcome to the 16th episode of the IDRiM podcast. So, this week is a continuation of last week's episode. So, last week we very much have Harris and myself have embarked upon a more broader and frank discussion about disaster research and disaster practice. This week we're going to particularly focus on two main elements, and those two main elements are the use of artificial intelligence and the dangers associated with artificial intelligence, but also how we implement disasters through policy and actually how policy works. And in particular, I will go have talked a lot in this episode about a case study of how disaster policy has evolved since World War II in the UK, and what the current status is and how it was implemented, depending on who you ask, through COVID, successfully or not successfully. That is open to interpretation. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the early warning system, right? Before. It's been a technology. Then
Yeah.
how actually we can use the technology now as in the recent years, we are bombarded by the AI that's actually shifting our use of technology both in Asia and in Europe. From what I know in Asia, in Japan itself, they think that they are left behind in terms of AI compared to US and other part of the world. So they inject a lot of money to develop AI to many other fields, including disasters, in order to use more this. Although they already in Japan, they already, as you mentioned, they put very well connected early warning system, and also they also have a chatbot where people can actually ask through their social media about, and then they answer, oh, where is the evacuation zone? You should go there. There will be shelter or not. Okay, you should go to shelter, like that. But they want to develop more. In Europe, this is they also try to use that, but not thoroughly yet, especially in the research, because it's more conventional. From what I observed a few weeks here, that's looking towards the implementations of the technology to help them to increase in disaster research, particularly because a lot of them is still using the conventional method. How about UK? How AI has shaped the shift, or any technology has shaped the disaster research in UK?
Right. So in the UK, we are quite a late adopter of technology. So we've been quite old-fashioned in our approach. I mean, literally knocking on people's doors until a couple of years ago was the main communication. Or literally, I'm just thinking back to the 90s and the early 2000s. If you want in the 90s, in the early 2000s, if you wanted to know that your area was at risk of a flood, you had to ring a flood line, and ask them, am I at risk? Or you used teletext. Now, teletext is really old technology. We don't have it anymore. The internet, obviously, late 90s was in its infancy. So again, how many people were using it? Internet usage in the UK is pretty high now. So, you can go and search for warnings if you think you're at risk. But actually advising people you are at risk really wasn't there. And in Japan, I know this, that if there's an earthquake, it literally takes over the television, doesn't it? It literally, and then if there's a tsunami, it makes the noise and it literally tells you what risk, how much of tsunami is coming. In the UK, we don't do that. We don't tell people that there's a risk coming, even with TV. The only way you might know on TV is if you're watching rolling news. So historically, a lot of time before people, until before this technology came out with the mobile phone, one of the only ways to find out if they were at risk was social media. Now, we've mentioned social media before. and we've done previous episodes on social media with Simon Dixon, where Dickinson, where he literally was talking about people watching and asking are they at risk, and that community thing. Yes, we had that, but we also have this thing about is it reliable? What the warnings are, and I mean I've seen after the Noto earthquake, lots of misinformation about it being an energy weapon and this sort of stuff. And I've seen in other disasters where pictures of other unrelated disasters are put in and say this is happening now. So again, it's about trustworthiness, and do we trust the technology? The technology that we're using. Artificial intelligence. We like to say that we are the leader in artificial intelligence. We've hosted artificial intelligence conferences. I know that the Met Office are implementing artificial intelligence in their weather forecasting, increasing the reliability, but you can never get it fully right. Also, now we can have with more measuring, we can measure the risk of flooding increasingly. But I'm going to flip it on its head here and talk about artificial intelligence the other way.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it a risk? Where do we draw the line on its usage? So I, a couple of years ago, read this book, because I get the name wrong, Procasius, and it's it talks about by Toby Ord, and it talks about the existential threats to society and the future of humanity, and there's a whole chapter based upon artificial intelligence. And because when we get to a stage where computers can talk to each other and they have this element to think for themselves, where does humans lay in that risk? And that is the bigger question, when it's the unknown question. So for me, artificial intelligence in some respects is a good thing, but we have to be careful because that will put into a future risk. But also flip it again a little bit. We talk about risk and disasters, and we talk about financial disasters. If AI starts taking over people's jobs, isn't that also a financial disaster that's waiting for us? Because if there's no work, where's the concept of money going to go? Because you need money going around in an economy, which means people need to work for an economy to work. If all, and we've seen during COVID, when all transactions stop, you go into a recession or a depression, which is another disaster. So there are different ways you can view it. Of it, the Terminator style, AI going to kill us all, to actually a more subtle. If it takes our jobs, it leads to a financial disaster. So actually, you've talked about technology. Technology is a good thing, but it's a huge risk for us as well when we think about it, if we want to look at it from the other perspective.
Yeah, well, you raised very interesting question there, but well, I have my own answer on that. I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure it is fit in our podcast today. Well, for me, in my mind, because like I was a computer scientist, so I obviously studied AI extensively. So it's basically it's just the current state of AI. It's not as risk as the later state, which is, in my perspective, perhaps we will only reach it in the 5 to 10 years, because like now it's getting faster and faster. So, but the current state of AI is not risk at all, because first it heavily relies on data. It heavily relies on data. So it's basically depends on the data and basically relies very much on the electricity, which is you can just shut off and like it's finished, and like you can just feed it with the correct data on all those things, and like it's behave as expected. But if you put it with the wrong data, then that's a risk. But again, it's the questions of how have the authority of that. Secondly, is you mentioned about the financial disaster, people doesn't have a job due to AI. In my own view on this is because this kind of thing happens because the disparity of economy that we have right now, because like the people who got stolen the job is basically low level jobs that basically can be automated, means that there is disparity there, because as a tools it should be usable for all, and everyone should be benefit from all. If there is someone who let's say get disadvantages from that tools, it means that there is a disparity the way in economic, for example, because of that. Now, looking at this, I mean, looking at the risk of the people got stolen is basically, as you mentioned before, it's like, we put the academic as practicality, where this low worker peoples basically just instead of replace completely with AI, just teach them to use it and increase their productivity instead of just, okay, we just replace it. No, you should not replace the people. Increase their salary. I mean, increase their life quality, the quality of livelihood of them, by introduce these tools, these amazing tools, for example. Because the concept of AI for me, it's just the next version of search engine. Before, as you mentioned, that okay, people need to call the flood line whether to know to get the race or not, because like we are very detached of the source of informations. We need to read the newspapers, we need to read the newspaper, we need to go to the library, and then come the internet. We just search the internet. But even after the internet, we look at so many pages and we need to read one by one. Now we're having AI, we just ask them and they give us the informations based on the knowledge they accumulate. So it's basically just, again, the next version of search engine, not really the intelligence that threatens our livelihood, because that kind of thing, it's still far away. I'm not sure this this will be put in our podcast or not, but yeah, but I think the current technology should be used as a means of aggregating more knowledge that we have, because like the disaster we face will be more complex in the futures. We will facing multi hazards, multi vulnerabilities, systemic risk. Come from the natural hazards, come from the terrorism, come from the war, something like all of that. So we need all these things, all the knowledge that perhaps as humans require a lot of efforts, but we have the tools here to actually accumulate, aggregate all this data, and then give us an options. So it's basically what we can use this is basically to provide us the smaller options that we should look at, and then the expert who already experienced, so accumulate all the knowledge their own decide, or the decision makers decide based on this smaller options, instead of looking at so many different options, so many combinations that it's perhaps too difficult. But all these things, all these combinations of the hazards or disasters, then aggregated by AI. Okay, this is your priority. You choose between these three options and then do this. And then again, the responsibility still lies on the people who choose the options, but not the AI, because the AI is just a tool that they use to get those smaller options. That's my view.
Well, I'm just going to say this here. There's something you said about, the use of AI, to give people information, up to date information. I get what you mean by this about, give them information about, and we communicate this, based on this knowledge to communicate, etc. So I'm guessing you're thinking about, that more knowledge gives you an informed choice, an informed, But
Yes.
here's the question, and this maybe, could AI then fix mistrust? So there's always this old theory that the more knowledge is inherently better because because of, you've got a more informed decision.
Yeah.
But what we're finding is that sometimes actually it's the inverse, because what we find with social media is that we've never had so much information with the online news, social media. Yet our trust of institutions is
Yeah.
declining
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
of misinformation that social media is driven. So
Mm.
would maybe AI actually increase, trust again in our institutions to tell us there's a threat coming, you need to prepare and do X, Y, and Z?
Mm.
I just wonder.
Well, that's the risk, of course. Again, that's
Mm,
the mistrust. Again, AI only works on what the data they fit. It's mean that if they collect all the data in the internet, for example, of course there's a lot of misinformation there. It's mean that
mm,
not everyone, not everything can be processed as a truth, right?
mm,
So it's basically in the some in one side, of course, it will increase the mistrust. But there's also, well, we're still here, Mark, right? You and
mm,
I are expert here. The experts now, the task perhaps using these tools more carefully. Look at how, look at how, look at how the collect the informations that collected by AI, or let's say aggregated by AI, and checking it whether it's really something that we should trust or something that we can put our faith on, then communicate to people. So it's basically now, instead of two ways communications between the experts or the decision makers with the people affected of disasters, for example. But this should be three ways, because like now there is another technological entity in the middle that we should use it as a source of, not source, as a hub of knowledge between them. And then, okay, I got this information from AI. I'm not sure I can trust this. And then, oh, I know that information it's not correct. Then it's still like that way. So it's, instead of now two ways communications that we expected, it become three ways.
mm,
That's my view. I agree with you that the mistrust will be increased, because like the misinformations that collected for all many datas there are maybe tangled when the AI producing the knowledge for the one who prompted. But now there's still expert that has accumulated the knowledge of on what's right and what's correct. Then this also need to be communicated. So instead of two-way communications, become the triangle that's one hub used by two peoples. Then these two peoples interact with each other.
mm. Yeah, I think let's move on because we could be here all day about AI.
Yeah,
But let's actually move on to something that we have talked about, and
yeah,
I've
yeah,
just
yeah.
mentioned
Sure,
about
sure.
institutions. No, it's fine.
Yeah, yeah,
It's actually great, and we talk
yeah.
about institutions, and one of the questions when I was putting this we were putting this together, I had,
Mm,
what are the key institutions or frameworks that shape disaster research and practice, in
mm,
Europe and Asia?
mm. Well, this is what drive it is. It's actually very similar. It's basically
Mm,
one part of the governments that are responsible for the either disaster management or disaster response. But in Europe, in Sweden, usually they're more about the civil protection or civil contingencies. So it's basically in the way it's not too different, although the perspective of their handling it is different. In Indonesia, for example, it's also highly coupled with military, which is the military doing the response, which is from European perspective, they're moving further away from that kind of things. Meanwhile, in Japan, it's also like that. More about they rely so much on scientists. They have the science council and like uh, some other response institutions that rely on the university as their source of decision making. And then the body of the government use that only for small reasons, use the military, especially if the disaster escalates so high. Meanwhile, in Europe, it's usually like using again, I mentioned the civil protection, the civil contingencies. Then this one, who's responsible doing all related of disasters, that they usually the shifting the framework. Like, okay, we want to know about this, about how to evaluate the vulnerability of our system. We want to know how to actually resilience toward the climate. So this framework of this body of the governments, it's basically following that. And as you know, that the European Union also have their own structures that drive the research on this, which is in Asia, it's more about country to country government. They don't really much cooperation, although in Southeast Asia they have the collaboration on disaster response, but not much on disaster research. How about UK? Do UK have collaborations or just driven by its own institutions?
UK is a bit of a weird one because, as mentioned, we were part of the European Union, so we would have been part of some of the elements of some of the structures of what the European Union would do with the summer contingency. But we have our own laws and our own ways of doing it, as you can quite imagine. So thinking about it today is a lot of it has changed rapidly in the last 25 years. And so pre 2004, we would be very similar to, as you just said about Indonesia, a more military based approach. So a lot of our old laws about disasters were based upon Civil Defence Act of 1948. So literally the word in there is just gives it away. Civil defence. Defence we associate with military. So therefore they took a lot of this. A lot of the thoughts started to change though, because the idea was is that post World War II, it's about recovery from war. It's that element of it. That's the biggest threat potentially in the next few years. Again, there's another war, so we have to start preparing for it. Against hostile targets, and that is not a surprise given the Cold War, which started around the same time that law came in. But then, if you think about it, post Cold War, it was an outdated system, very outdated. I mean, you think about it from 1948 to 2004, it never really changed in very much. So we were post World War II structures in a modern society, and it just doesn't match. Basically, what had happened is that as the frame of a disaster changed, and how we viewed the disaster. So, terrorism we think of the late 90s, 2000s when all this started to really question, is these structures fit for purpose? And if you think about, late 90s, the IRA had stopped its bombing campaign. So the threat against the UK from external factors, significantly less. And then we start to look at, is a military approach a good idea? So the UK had 3 major incidences. I wouldn't say they're all disasters as such, but it could have been. So the 3 were the fuel protests of 2000. So what had happened was that the price of petrol was so expensive. It was much more expensive than the rest of Europe, even more expensive than Norway, as you know, is a very expensive place to live. So what they did was that the oil workers blocked all the depots. The lorry drivers blocked all the depots. Meant that the fuel pumps dried out to the point where there was even questions how we were going to get ambulances and fire engines to emergencies. So that is an emergency. That could have been a disaster, but it's not a disaster you think of. And it's definitely not. I mean, the idea then of the military having to force its way through a protest to get fuel to keep the country going, not a good look, especially for a democracy. Then you had the mass flooding event of 2000s, in particular around the north of the UK, around York. And then you had, and we talked about this before we started recording, the outbreak of foot and mouth in 2001. And the outbreak of foot and mouth in 2001, I think, was the biggest turning point of this, because we had huge amounts of inquiry into this about did we handle this correctly? So, I mean, to give a bit of fact, I remember it. I was a kid, but I can still remember there were certain restrictions on your movement at that time. So a little bit different to COVID, but basically you could not, over, countryside, you could not walk over the countryside in case you spread the disease to other areas. And that was enforced by military. The military had to literally round up infected animals. And the way it worked is that we only had 2,000 cases, on farms across the UK. but it meant that they had to kill 6 million cows and sheep. So disruption to food supply, but then the imagery that came on everyone's television sets on the night. And what I might do is, if we get a clip, I'll put it into this podcast, is of literally the military shooting at the back of the head of the cow, pile them high, and then literally set them on fire. The imagery of the military coming into people's farms, killing their animals, again, it just doesn't look, it doesn't look right. And I think for me, that when I look at it, I think that was the turning point, but really much. But then we also had these, when we talk about, the threats of, terrorism and external threats, we had 9/11, and the new type of threat that we're dealing with. It's not a bomb on the streets or, somebody dropping a bomb. It's about, actually, using weapons like planes against us. So the law had to be updated. And I remember, and so actually the law was quite good because it meant that it was a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. So you had local resilience forums. So the idea is that they could then look at, carry out risk assessments. We got in the UK, we have loads of, flood resilience forums nowadays because of the risk of floods in the UK. And the way that it's done is it has two parts, and it's about, how do you define an emergency? And this is something that we have, huge debates about in, the academic literature. What is an emergency? What is a disaster? And the way that they say it is, it's as, a threatened significant damage to human welfare, environment, or national security. That's how they view it. So it's very much about, it's about disease, it's a hostile environment, but it's also climate. It's a bit of a weird one. It's about climate, you could argue, with that when you look at it. And anything that could, threaten the political, administrative, or economic stability of the country. Very broad. And there is a criticism that abroad, I mean, I could literally say, well, we should, activate it right now for climate change. It's that broad.
Yeah.
It's not meant to be that broad, but by law, it's quite broad, and it has to be tightened because of it. And the way that it's done is that it drives a lot of the response at a local level. So instead of the military coming in, and dealing with the issue, it's local authorities, it's local government, it's the police force, it's the fire, service, ambulance service, the hospitals, our national health trusts, environment agency. So it's very much about, they take, a role, or even the electricity, distributors, and the stewards, telephone networks, the rail networks, all these, they all now play individual roles. So it's being decentralized. Now, I don't know about your perspective, but would a decentralized way work? Because then it comes to the question as who's leading what and who's leading the response to disaster. It's meant to be the office of the civil contingencies in the UK. But if you've got multiple disasters and you've got all these people coming at you, is this a good approach? It's what we still got today. But also, it has a clause which I know has always been a little uncomfortable, which is very much about, in an emergency, the government has complete control, complete power. So if you say here, it says there's temporary emergency regulations. Basically, the idea is that if there's a disaster that needs, because to declare a major disaster, sometimes you have to go through laws to get emergency powers. So in the UK, there's that's what we did during COVID, and we kept renewing them. But what could have happened was the Prime Minister could have just declared an emergency straight away and take complete control, literally almost lock Parliament out of any decisions. And I don't know if you've ever, and I know this is international, but I don't know if you've ever seen a TV series called COBRA.
No.
So I'll put a link up about it. COBRA actually is literally our office for emergencies, and it actually shows, it's a great, and it actually came out 2 months before COVID, which is the irony, and it actually shows how emergency powers the Prime Minister does have in this country, to the point where he can deploy the military troops on the ground in an emergency. there are, obviously limitations still that can be, that are used, but in emergency, say that an area is going to have no electricity supply for months because of major transformer, blowouts or, external threats, you can declare these. So, and for a democracy like ours, it's an awkward feeling. But I don't know how, you feel about, that sort of, regulation. You think that is a good thing or a bad thing? I know I've gone a long time on that.
Yeah, it's okay. Well, in a way, it's like it's good and bad, but we don't know though. But I'm not sure because I've never been in emergency situation before.
Mm.
From what I know, it's in the Europe, in Nordics, for example, in Sweden, they try to have that again. Well, in preparation for war with Russia, but as part of the total defense, where if the emergency measures, emergency situation has been taken place, and what should they do? In Japan, they also have that in case of the North Korea coming. Indonesia, I'm not sure because they haven't been. We don't have that, but the military involvement is very great. Even the head of the disaster management authorities always come from the military. They emphasize that in order to respond of disaster, we need a very hierarchical structures, which is they relies on military to do that. So if I don't know if you've seen the news that they try to impeach the president of South Korea, but then the president of South Korea just declare emergency state, and then it's been overthrown in the parliament. I think as the main decision maker in the country, either whether it's the local authorities, I mean the city mayor or the governors or the presidents or the prime ministers or the similar roles should have the capability to declare that, but the check and balance should be in place, and they should also heavily involve the scientists to understand that what you do is whether correct or not. They perhaps in order to make a swift decisions, they can declare it very quickly, but should be evaluated day-to-day basis whether we should continue or stop with involve many different element of the people from the representatives of the people, from the parliament, from the science council, and then okay, we should stop this. It should be stopped today or should be stopped tomorrow, something like that. Because without the check and balance, the people in power can use it to their own gain, which is very bad for everyone, I think. But we don't know because the threat can evolve very quickly, can be escalated in a matter of seconds, and that the swift decisions lies on their hands. Therefore, it is still okay to have to establish that kind of system, but the evaluation system also should be accompanied that in order to make sure that the policy can be implemented correctly.
Also, I just want to add, you said about checks and balances there. In the UK, the Civil Contingency Act only grants the Prime Minister 30 days. After 30 days, he has to have Parliament approve it to keep going. So there is that check and balance, as you mentioned. Problem is that we run a first past the post system, so usually there's a government that has has a big majority. We've only had one coalition since World War II, which gives you a sense that if you win the election, you probably won it outright. So that means you're not going to get many dissenting voices.
Yeah.
So last question, how are emerging risks such as cyber disasters and or pandemics reshaping disaster research? And what are the potential future risks through our areas?
Well, yeah. Well, talking about emergent risk, it's basically now it's what we face in every part of the world is climate change. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually increasing the intensity of disaster, natural hazards in all regions, but also it will also affect uh, the the capacity that we have to ensure that our livelihood can still go on, especially in the terms of the lot of heat stroke and winter storms. It's been that the number of food will also decrease in the future.
Mm-hmm.
That's the current emerging topics in every part of the world. In
Yep.
Asia, it's now looking on how it's actually bringing more severe weathers. As the beginning of this year until now, Indonesia has been poured a lot of rainfall, a lot of floods. Japan as well, wildfires, and all those things. Which is they're shifting the focus. They want to in Asia Pacific to understand, to identify at which point or at which factors actually this will increase the disaster in our own. Meanwhile, in Europe, from what I know, not only the climate change they're threatening, they also threatening the security. This is coming from the antagonistic threats from the particularly the Russians that still well in the recent years it's not will not going out. It will be very strong threats that threatening especially Nordic areas and the part of the Eastern Europe, and the Europe still trying so hard to avoid coming to the central and western part. So that's the emerging risk they will each region will face.
Mm.
And in terms of the technology that we already discussed earlier, they also like some intention to research about the risk of AI and the use of AI, the risk of using AI. Perhaps that's more fitting title in our daily life, because as you mentioned, how the ethical profile of the AI, how it's basically it's misinformations will be part of it, and how it's shifting the way we live from now on. That's the
Mm.
emerging risk that they're focusing. The natural hazards still will be always in the focus in the Asia, but in Europe maybe not so much. Uh, since more for in terms of the societal disasters point of view, and the resilience of the system, instead of identifying what kind of intensified hazards that will come.
Mm.
UK, I guess, you can explain later more on, since you have the storms this years, and perhaps like also you mentioned earlier, terrorism will also increase in the future. Is it not?
Storms definitely, yes. So
Yes.
storms are a bit of a weird thing for us. So
Mhm.
we're used to storms in the UK.
Mhm.
But what's happening is that the frequency intensities are definitely trending upwards, in particular in winter months.
Yeah.
Um, I feel that terrorism is a threat. I think that it's a bit of a weird one because I think that we're seeing terrorism threats from new areas that we've never seen before.
Mhm.
I particularly feel that, and this is a personal opinion, very much
Yeah.
the rise of the far right is becoming a increasing risk
Mhm.
of terrorism, and we have seen this. And I will put a link below of some of the, the reporting of this in the UK.
Yeah.
If yes, the climate is a very much a big thing. Wildfires are becoming an
Mhm.
issue. So
Mhm.
the UK this month has had plenty of wildfires, more than I can remember, and
Mhm.
it's only April. It's quite early in the year.
Yeah.
Um, Security threats. And this new type of security threat that we're not used to. So you mentioned about
Mhm.
almost like preparing for war. What you're talking about in Sweden,
Mhm.
we're not preparing for war as in just yet. I mean,
Yeah.
there has been murmurings, but we're not preparing for
Mhm.
that type of war. What
Yeah.
we're preparing for is more of a hybrid war. Um,
Mhm.
so the UK as an island means that we're actually a lot more vulnerable
Mhm.
to risks from bad actors in terms of a lot of we got electricity cables between France, Ireland, Norway, that keeps us all the lights on. The data as well. We talk a lot about data, today as
Yeah.
well. Our internet cables go right underneath all these seas, and we've seen more recently how in the Nordic region the internet cables have been cut. So we have that risk as well. Gas pipelines as well, because we've got the North Sea. But also, I feel that there are other ones that we've not mentioned so far, zootonic diseases. We've just seen with COVID-19, and the increased risk because we're not just from the UK, but as we've seen in Africa, we're encroaching onto land which we don't historically live off, and that means that our interface between nature and humans is increasing. I remember before COVID-19, the biggest threat for health, which we were talking about, is very much about bird flu. H5N1 influenza, which hadn't fully crossed over yet, and it wasn't very hard, to transmit. And then we think of SARS. SARS was very deadly, but hard to transmit. A bit like H5N1, and it's always been the threat that that this could mutate into a way that it can spread. And are we on the brink of another pandemic? It's a question, but have we learned our lessons? Probably not. And also, you talked about AI and we've talked about technology. But there's one threat related to technology that we haven't talked about today. Can technology stay online during a solar storm? And what happens if we get a Carrington event? Are we going to go back to the Dark Ages? And how do we cope with technology not working for days, weeks, or months on hand? When nowadays the society is becoming more cashless, our money stored away in vaults away on a computer that might not be working. Water supplies require technology, gas supplies, electricity, everything requires technology now. So how do we prepare for that style of emergency? And, I think that the two other ones is volcanic. You talk about in the UK, in Europe, we don't get much about volcanic. We do. When we do, it is quite big. So I think of Lackey in the 1700s that killed a significant portion of the UK from sulfur dioxide poisoning. So comes into lungs, turns into sulfuric acid, burns you from inside out. That is still obviously a threat. But the other one, and the last one, which I think is in 2025 could be the greatest threat, is economic. We're seeing this global downturn now because with trade tariffs, and as of such, that's going to cause a slowdown like 2008 again. And if you look at tariffs, always slow down economies. And the concern is that if we start moving towards a slowdown, 2008 all over again, people will have stresses, will die of cardiovascular diseases, suicide, etc. And so I feel that what a way to end this podcast on so many doom and glooms, but the work of disaster research never ends. And there are plenty of risks that we are now facing increasingly.
I forgot to say something. So many things about disaster, especially like that. I mean, like the hybrid threats, the hybrid hazards, multi hazards now affecting us. We should ensure that we also have so many sources of vulnerability, and how to ensure that we still resilience against all that. So, should I close the podcast?
Yes, please, because we're at 1 hour 40 minutes.
So okay, everyone, thanks a lot for listening to us or watching us from YouTube. This is special episodes that perhaps if we have a lot of people who like this, we also can do this again in the near futures. Perhaps not only us, but we also will invite different experts to discuss, or simply just talking about random things like this. Not really randoms, but more thematically topics like this in the future. Hopefully enjoy these episodes and see you next week.